You're all
Thank
right.
you for doing this, by the way. I know that was a real pain. You had lots of stuff going on. And
Yes. Made it work, didn't I?
I appreciate
Yeah.
it so
I
much.
just got up about 10 o'clock and had to get Sherry out to water's edge. Just came from there. I left her.
Okay.
Huh?
You okay?
Got a broken arm. Other than that,
Oh. This,
is there a
Called the
problem?
police out on you?
She fell off a ladder
what?
Start anytime.
a week ago.
I just want to make sure you're not too stressed out to eat your cookies because I'm right here.
Yeah, by the way, let's not be bargaining for cookies.
Are you unmuted?
Do I have to call the roll of the city council? I was just going to make sure everybody knows who's here.
As everybody introduce themselves.
Right. Okay. Am I unmuted? Oh. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm calling this special meeting to order. And I would like to introduce those of us on the city council that are here. And I know there's one council member who's zooming in, and that is Darcy Long Curtis. Darcy, hello. And going from left to right, Linda Miller, City Council, Rod Runyon, Scott Randall, and Tim McLaughlin. And I'm the mayor, Rich Mays. And at this point, I would like everyone, why don't we start with the county? If anybody is here, I know there's people here from the county. If you would introduce yourself and what you do at the county. Why don't we start with Scott?
Hi, this is Scott Hagee. I'm a commissioner with Wasco County.
Okay. I don't see anybody else from the county.
Hey, Rich, this is Kathy.
Oh, hi, Kathy.
Hi.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Wasco County Commissioner. Thanks.
Okay.
Steve Kramer, Wasco County Commissioner.
Welcome, Steve. Anybody else from the county? Okay, the port, why don't we start with the staff and then we'll go to the commissioners. Andrea?
Hi, Andrea Kloss, Executive Director, Port of the Dalles.
And Greg?
Greg Wiest, Commission, Port of the Dalles, President.
Mike?
Mike Courtney, Port of the Dalles Commissioner.
David Griffith, Commissioner.
Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Anybody else from the port?
Wallace.
Oh, I see Stacy. Stacy?
Yep, Stacy Coburn, Port of the Dalles Commissioner.
All right. What'd you
Yep.
say?
Robert Wallace.
Robert
Mr.
Wallace.
Wallace.
Yep, Robert Wallace, Port of the Dalles Commissioner.
Okay. Anybody else from the port? Okay, let's go to the staff. Would the staff please introduce yourself? Those of you that are here.
Yes. Well, for the city, we have the city manager, Julie Kruger. We have the interim community development director, Alice Cannon, and myself, Steve Harris, the soon-to-be outgoing community development director.
Okay, and I see Don. Don Hurt,
Oh,
you're muted.
Hello.
How about a name and a title there for you? Associate planner or something. Okay, well, Don's with the Department of Community Development.
Senior planner, sorry.
Senior planner, thank you. Let's see, Elizabeth Turner, would you like to introduce yourself? Is she a citizen?
I'm just a citizen, and I spent a lot of years helping the county with agricultural planning for about 17 years, and I know planning is really, really important. And so I wanted to listen about what's happening regarding the city and the county, and I'm assuming it's about the Gorge Commission and this 20% or 20 acres, which they said maybe 40. Anyway, I'm just really interested because I know it's not enough.
Okay, thank you very much and welcome. CJ, I can't see his last name.
Yes, hi, CJ Doxey with Angelo Planning Group.
Okay, great. And I know Matt, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Matt Hasty, Angelo Planning Group. I'll be presenting the results of the buildable lands inventory today. And then CJ's the guy who actually did a lot of the technical analysis. So he's here to answer any questions that I have trouble with on the details.
Great, thank you. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Jonathan Cara, Jonathan's our new city attorney. Jonathan, you want to say hi?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Jonathan Cara, City Attorney for the City of the Dalles.
Okay. Is there anybody else that I've missed? Okay. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Community Development, Steve Harris, for a staff report. Steve?
Great. Well, thank you, Mayor, members of council, members of the county commission, and members of the court board of directors. I want to thank you for taking time out of your workday for this meeting to discuss the results of our employment lands, buildable lands inventory. And as Matt said, he will be giving the presentation today, and that part of his team is here, CJ, who did a lot of the research and a lot of the analysis on this. And so just a few remarks before I turn the microphone over to Matt. I wanted to put some context into this buildable lands inventory that the city has undertaken, and so you can get a sense of appreciation of what the city has done in the last 4 years under the city council's leadership in economic and housing studies and activities. And if I could, I would just like to read a brief list of some of the work that we've accomplished these last 4 years under these two items. Beginning in 2016, the city undertook and completed a residential buildable lands inventory. In 2017, we completed a housing strategies report and implementation roadmap. In 2017, we also completed a housing and residential land needs assessment. In 2019, the City Council passed an extensive amendment to our land use development code for residential development. A portion of that work was grant funded through the state. In 2019, we completed a downtown visioning exercise. That also was a grant funded study. In 2019, we completed an economic opportunities analysis and action plan, and Matt will be speaking on that this afternoon as well, and how this current buildable lands inventory implements a portion of that work. And we have 3 new studies that the staff will be undertaking here shortly, and these are all grant-funded studies through the state. The first is implementation of House Bill 2001. We've entitled that the Missing Middle Housing Plan for the city, and that will involve a revisit of our development code for residential development. Again, that came out of that earlier housing strategies report and implementation roadmap. We are also within a select number of cities in the state that we will be conducting for HB 2003, a housing production strategic plan. The state reached out to the staff several months ago asking if we'd like to participate in this effort to develop strategies on producing needed housing in the community. And again, that is a grant-funded study. And the last study that the city will be beginning sometimes towards the end of the year, the beginning of the next calendar year, is a West Side area study and master plan. And that is also a grant-funded study. So just again, in passing, the buildable lands inventory today is part of this larger effort that the city has been working on for the past 4 years. Again, under the leadership of the city council, to have a more robust and thorough analysis of the community's housing sector and our commercial and industrial lands sectors as well. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I would like to turn the virtual microphone over to Mr. Matt Hasty, and he will lead you through today's presentation of this buildable lands inventory. And I believe Matt has a PowerPoint presentation, and so you'll see those slides on your screens. So, Matt, if you will.
All right, thanks, Steve. Can everybody see the presentation up there?
Yes. Yeah.
All right, well, I got the first part right, so that's always good. So I'm going to walk through this presentation. It's not super long as PowerPoint presentations go. It's, I think, about 13 slides. I'm going to suggest that people hold at least most of their questions or comments till I get through it. But I would also say, if you have a question for clarification, you know, I say something, it's really not clear what I meant, please feel free to ask me those questions. But I would suggest holding off on others till we get done, and I'll try not to make it take too long. I'll try to give you a reasonable amount of information, but happy to answer questions at the end of that, at the end of the presentation. So if that sounds okay to everybody, I'll kind of jump into it. There we go. So Steve gave you some of this background already, and kind of talked about this study in relationship to the earlier phase 1 of the economic opportunities analysis. I just wanted to also talk about, and you know, the fact that this will help inform future planning processes and future decisions and strategies. I wanted to note that, you know, one of the overall goals for us is to make sure that we're being consistent with local conditions and data, but also with state requirements. It's important for a number of reasons. One, because if the city approves or adopts this study, it also needs to be acknowledged by the State Department of Land Conservation and Development, and they're going to want to make sure it's consistent with their requirements. And we want to make sure that this doesn't get appealed. We don't want to give Jonathan too much work, at least on that end of things. Want to avoid it being appealed and going through some kind of legal process. So that's an important objective from our point of view. So, and also just note that we produced several different memos and a set of maps as part of this process. I think what you received was a kind of a combined file that includes all the memos we produced. We also will be providing all of the data behind the maps and memos to the city so that you can continue to use and update that information as you move forward. Steve, I think, mentioned that one of the products of the first phase of the EOA was an economic development action plan. We're identifying some updated actions for inclusion in that action plan. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about that when we get to the point of presenting this to the City Council for approval and adoption. But there's a number of recommended actions that will include specifically related to land supply and kind of how you continue to look at that and monitor that and work with that in the coming years. So there was a fairly extensive review process for this project. We produced a preliminary analysis and memo. And frankly, we knew there would be a lot of comments and changes to that memo. It was based on readily available existing GIS data, aerial photos, et cetera. And we knew that you all would have a lot of information and knowledge about some of the properties in the inventory. So the city had formed a stakeholder advisory committee. We met with that group twice. We had a fair bit of additional communication and meetings with representatives of the Port of the Dalles and Wasco County. We have some conversations with representatives of Google, and I'll kind of talk about all these things a little bit more later, as well as consultation and direction with the State Department of Land Conservation and Development to make sure that on some specific properties and issues, we were being consistent with their guidelines and requirements and protocols. So ultimately that translated into a fair number of rounds of review and revision of the memos, maps and data, and also into us preparing a couple of additional supporting memos, particularly one that talks about the capacity of the sites owned by Google that are not yet developed. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. And so I think, I don't even know what version we're on at this point, maybe 8 or 9 or something of the overall BLI memo. We feel pretty good at this point that it is consistent with those state requirements, that it does reflect the comments we've heard. I will say I understand it, the results, the outcomes may not be what everybody wants to see or was hoping for, but we do feel good about it meeting those objectives we talked about earlier. So I'm going to kind of go through some of this in a little more detail now. Just kind of a quick overview on the methodology of a buildable lands inventory. So it covers all the land in the urban growth boundary, not just in the city limits, but within the UGB. So that's kind of what we start out with. We then focus in on land that's zoned for employment, that's zoned for commercial and industrial use, and we pull out land that's zoned for residential, institutional, non-employment uses. So we end up focusing on those employment lands. We also pull out land that's committed for public facilities. It may be zoned for employment uses, but if it's committed for essentially a non-employment use, then those properties get deducted from the inventory. We then categorize properties into vacant, partially vacant, or redevelopable properties. And I'll talk about kind of how we define all these terms on the next slide. And then we identify lands that are constrained by specific factors as identified in the state's administrative rules and statutes. And some of those include wetlands, floodplains, steeply sloped areas, hazard areas, contaminated areas. We also deduct land that's needed for streets or other infrastructure from these properties to get to then an assessment or a calculation of net buildable acres. And again, this is land that, based on the state's requirements, has the capacity for future employment. It may not be available today or tomorrow. It may be owned by a specific property owner that has plans to develop it. So it's not available necessarily for sale or development by somebody else, but it has the capacity for new jobs. And that's really kind of what the inventory is focused on. So there are a number of things or sort of reasons we can't use to take land out of the inventory. And those are noted in kind of the last part of this funnel. Properties that may have some issues that are going to result in them being more expensive to develop. And unless they have some of those specific constraints I talked about a minute ago, we can't just take those lands out of the inventory. This is a long-term, a 20-year inventory. So, we might hear that, well, hey, this person, they're not going to sell this land, and so it's not really available. For good or ill, that's not a reason that we can use to take those properties out of the inventory. Somebody may say, hey, we're not sure this is really marketable in the next couple of years, 5 years, even 10. Again, because it's a 20-year inventory, we can't just take those lands out. And that's really the kind of the point of coming up with a set of economic development strategies or actions, is to address those kinds of characteristics or concerns moving forward. So it's just kind of a summary of, again, that methodology, just a little bit more on how we define these terms, because those questions come up for people when they look at these reports. Developed means it's essentially, mostly or fully developed. It has little to no additional capacity for new jobs based on what's on the property now. Vacant, it's got minimal to no physical improvements, and there may be portions of these vacant properties that are constrained that we pull out or deduct from the developable land. But if a property doesn't have development on it, or it has development that's valued at below a certain threshold, we assume it's vacant. Partially vacant means there are some improvements on the property, but it's large enough, given the zoning and given the improvements that are there, that additional development is possible, that there is the capacity for additional employment or additional jobs on that property. Committed, again, this is not committed for some future employment use, but committed for a non-employment use, committed for a wastewater treatment facility or a water system facility or something of that nature. Constrained, when you look at the maps, you see constrained parcels in a couple of different ways. One, properties that are completely constrained by some factor, and two, you'll see later kind of some hatched areas. Those are the constraints on a property where we've deducted the acreage that's constrained from the buildable land. And again, I talked about what some of those things are: floodplains, wetlands, contaminated areas, et cetera. So that acreage that's constrained gets deducted from the buildable land acreage. So I talked about the fact that we made a fair number of changes to the inventory as we moved through the process of reviewing it with the advisory committee and with other folks in the community. I'll just kind of touch on some of those specific changes. In the initial draft of the inventory, there were a number of properties owned by the Port of the Dalles that the port indicated we really had not categorized or characterized properly. So we made a fair number of changes to properties in the inventory there to be consistent with those comments. The Lockheed Martin site that has contamination on it, we ultimately removed from the inventory based on conversation with the advisory committee, but also some documentation that property is considered contaminated and not considered to be developable within the planning period. And that's what a lot of this comes down to, is just kind of having the documentation that we can say this, and when the state looks at this, they say, oh, yeah, you've established kind of the factual base for these assumptions that you've got in the inventory. Areas constrained by BPA easements. You know, while some things can be done in those easement areas based on the process that's needed to, that has to be undertaken to do that, and the pretty significant limitations on those areas, we deducted the acreage in the easements from the supply of buildable land. The community college site, early in the process, there was some suggestion that we include the community college site as a potential property in the inventory with some capacity for employment. But ultimately, based on kind of the status of the college's master plan and the sort of timeline for development of the remainder of the site, we did not include that, and it's not zoned for employment, so it would be unusual to include that. So we ultimately took that out. The Ameritized property, initially, we showed that as partially vacant because only I'm going to say a modest portion of that site is covered by improvements. The rest of it's used for outdoor storage and staging. But based on discussion with the owner and the committee, we indicated that is developed, it's being used. So we removed that from the inventory. Same thing with the Munson paving sites. They're essentially, they don't have improvements on them, but they are being used for those purposes. We deducted those or did not include those in the inventory. The Walmart site is currently still the subject of some litigation. However, over the long term, over the 20-year planning period, we do consider that parcel to be have capacity for future commercial development. So that we kept in the inventory. The sites in the city owned by Google that are not developed, we spent a fair bit of time looking at those in terms of how much capacity do they have for future development? Do we think they have less capacity than the average property in the inventory zone for industrial use? Ultimately, we came to the conclusion based on discussions with representatives of Google, as well as looking at their sites in a lot of other communities, that they may have a little bit less capacity compared to other sites in the inventory, but not a lot. So we did reduce the relative capacity on those sites, but they still have a fair bit of capacity for future employment. And so you'll see that reflected in the inventory. So I'm just going to quickly show you kind of maps that you'll see or have seen in the memo. Then I think I just have a couple more slides after that, and then I'll be done talking and happy to answer questions or take comments. So this is just a zoning map for the city. And again, the kind of things you see in the legend on the upper right, those are the types of properties that are included in the inventory. This shows all the zoning categories, but it's the commercial and the industrial areas that we're focused on for the purposes of this inventory. This shows constraints. And so blue are wetlands, the green are floodplain hazard areas. There's some areas, not a lot of areas within the employment areas that have slopes over 25%, which get deducted, but they are there. You can see the BPA right-of-way areas that we deducted. You don't see the Lockheed Martin site here, but you do see it in a subsequent map as indicated as committed or constrained. So that just shows you the areas that got removed from the inventory in terms of being developable or having capacity for future employment. So this is just kind of a summary map of the results. Green parcels are vacant, yellow are partially vacant, and red are developed, and purple are committed, and that does include the Lockheed Martin site there in that designation, in that categorization. I'm gonna kind of zero in on a few sites that I talked about earlier in a moment, or I think in the next slide. So this is just a map that shows some of the sites I talked about earlier. Some of the existing sites owned by Google, they're considered developed, so they're not really part of the inventory of buildable land, or they don't represent capacity for additional development. But these other sites, the two Google sites that are shown in green, and the old rodeo grounds, which is essentially also in the same category, those all are considered as having capacity for future employment, although portions of them are constrained, and so the constrained portions have been deducted from the inventory. You also see the Walmart site there. The Superfund site, that actually is not considered developable. It's shown on this map, but I pointed out on the other maps, it's considered committed or constrained. And then I just showed you the college site down there in the lower part of the map. So talked about those earlier. Particularly those Google sites are really large sites, and I'll talk about that in terms of findings from this analysis in a moment as well. So summary of results, these are a couple of tables that are towards the end of the BLI summary memo. I'm not going to go through the top one in a lot of detail. I will note that if you try to add up the individual numbers to the totals, you're going to get some rounding errors. So that's what's going on there. That's why the numbers don't all match up. And just note in the top table, we're showing how or where the buildable land is in different zoning designations. And then we've kind of rolled that up to commercial and industrial in the bottom table. And then the bottom table is also showing what the estimated land demand was from that earlier phase of the economic opportunities analysis. It identified a range. And so then we compare that with net buildable acres that we identified in this process, and then show whether or not that results in a surplus or a deficit of land on the right-hand column of the bottom table. And kind of the bottom line is that we are showing a surplus both for commercial and for industrial land and for land in total based on our work and based on comparing that to the earlier phase of work. This is just a summary of kind of how that land is distributed among different size parcels, how many approximately acres there are in sites in different size ranges. And there was some work done as part of this process in terms of identifying where's kind of the greatest need lie in terms of need for certain size sites. The greatest need was identified in the 2 to 5 acre range and in the 12 to 18 acre range. And there's a decent number of sites in that 2 to 5 acre range. There's also some sites in the 0 to 2 acre range that, if consolidated, because they're adjacent to each other, would be in the 2 to 5 acre range. Not a lot of sites in the 5 to 12 acre range. And I will note that in the largest range, 12 to 18 acres, all those sites are owned by Google. So they're large sites, but they're not necessarily available for someone else to come along and purchase or develop. So findings, and this is, I think, my last slide. One, the analysis is consistent with state requirements. We, spent a lot of effort on that, again, to make sure that you have something that you can confidently adopt and have. We think, it should be acknowledged by the state, and we would hope would withstand appeal, given that, if someone were to do that. It does indicate a surplus of employment land, and the overall results of the study do not by themselves provide the basis for an expansion of UGB for employment purposes. Now, there's a couple of different ways communities can justify an expansion of a UGB. One is if they do not have enough land to meet 20-year employment or housing needs. The other is if they have identified the need for a certain type of use or type of site, and that is not found anywhere in the inventory. So that's not something we would do or have done as part of this process, but I did just want to put that out there as, that is something cities can look at. I'm not suggesting you do that, but I'm putting it out there. I already noted this, but your supply of industrial land is dominated by large sites already owned and planned for development, particularly those Google sites. And again, I do understand the concern that you've got a limited number of kind of more traditional sites that are available for somebody who wants to come in, and develop them, and they aren't owned by somebody else who has plans for them. So that is a finding of the inventory, and I understand that. I'm sensitive to that. The other thing just to note is that if you think about the supply of land kind of on a larger regional basis, there are properties in Dallasport that have the capacity or could be developed for future industrial use, but those are not included in this inventory because they are not within the city's UGB. So I'm noting that as sort of part of the regional supply, but also noting that those properties are not included in this inventory. So I think that was my last slide. I will stop and just take any questions or comments y'all might have.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to ask that everyone refrain from any comments initially. Well, you certainly are entitled to give a comment, but I would like the first part of this exercise to concentrate on questions of Matt or the staff as opposed to, editorial comments. So with that, I'm looking around the room here with the city council to see if there's any questions, at least at this point, from anyone. And I see no one. So does anybody, I see Councilor Long Curtis has a question. Please,
Yes.
please go ahead.
Thank you. So I had a couple of questions. Since the buildable land inventory report is based off of what the economic and employment needs found in the economic opportunities analysis, I just wanted to ask if the most recent EOA was done in 2007 and updated in 2010 and included information for the 2006 to 2026 period. Is that still an accurate basis for determining how much land we need?
So actually, your EOA was updated more recently than that. So this buildable lands inventory was the second phase of an update of your EOA. The first phase,
which is not on the website.
Not on the, yeah, and that was conducted by Bridge Economic.
Okay.
And that was actually done just within the last couple of years. And so it is actually looking at essentially the same planning period and the same planning horizon.
So I just want to comment to the group, not to Mr. Hasty, but when I was trying to compare and look at this document, I'm not sure why I couldn't find it since it is relevant to this part 2. I think that's information that we should have had available. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions looking at the screen? Commissioner Hagee.
Yeah, I have a question on page 13 of 15. It's in, I think, the main document. And there's a table in there. It's actually table 5. And so the question shows for industrial land, it says net buildable land acres, and it shows 175 acres. And so my question is, how much of that 175 acres is owned by Google or their subsidiaries?
I would have to go back into the details of the inventory, into the spreadsheet, unless CJ knows that answer, and he might. I do not know exactly how many. It's a substantial portion. I mean, I would say that if you include the 3 sites that we showed on the earlier map, the Google Site 2, and Rodeo Grounds, it is a substantial portion of the inventory. And I think while we're talking, we'll make sure CJ takes a look at that, and he can tell us how much of it.
Yeah. So for the, I may need to dig into some notes. I can pull it up relatively quickly and provide that in a few minutes.
Isn't that
Okay.
table 6 on the next page?
Yes and no. Let's have CJ take a look at it because he has the spreadsheets, and just give us a couple minutes.
Okay, that'd be fine. Let me ask a follow-up. Is it fair to say that Google probably owns the majority of that land? Over 50% for
over
sure.
50%, I would say, yeah.
And I think it
Yeah,
near
that
70% or over 70%.
could be.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, while CJ is looking that up, Councilor Long Curtis, I believe table 6 refers to the, okay, sites and buildable acres. Okay, never mind. Okay. Other questions while we're waiting for the information from CJ? What?
Mayor Mays,
Yes, Andrea.
Andrea Kloss. So I guess, first of all, just as a point of order, do you want questions about the document that we received? Is that where we are right now? Just
Yes,
clarification questions.
As opposed to comments, let's get questions out of the way to regarding the report. Yeah.
Thank you. So my first question is that there's a couple times in the document where theoretically is the word that's used, and then buildable is in quotes. How am I supposed to interpret that?
You're supposed to interpret it as properties where someone could build or develop on them within the planning period. It doesn't mean that tomorrow somebody could come out and build on that site. It doesn't mean that it's buildable right now. So that's how you should interpret it.
So that's how I did interpret it. And so then taking like the leap to the extreme, that means that the entire city of the Dalles is theoretically buildable. So my point is that I don't like that language because I think it misleads people to a conclusion that is probably erroneous.
So I'll try to respond to that. It doesn't mean every property in the Dalles, because buildable does not include properties that are already developed. There are properties that are either classified as vacant or partially vacant. So they have unbuilt portions that have the capacity for new development. So I don't disagree that somebody could misinterpret that, or that it's open to misinterpretation or confusion. Buildable that's the term that's used within the state administrative rules and statutes. We can certainly take out the word theoretically if we think that would be helpful and would reduce any confusion for folks. buildable is the term, kind of the term of art that we do need to use to be consistent with.
I understand that, but buildable is in quotes in the document. And so that's like, okay, well, that sort of leads you to interpretation. So anyway, that's my comment. The next one is twice in the document, it's mentioned Dowsport regional development, regional land supply. We've talked about this numerous times at the meetings. I'm really disappointed to see it in here again. I think that this is a plan for the city of the Dalles. Mayor Mays, Commissioner Hagee, others of us have commented on why this doesn't make sense to have it in here. Certainly, we look at regionality when we're looking at citing projects, but to include it in the city of the Dalles analysis, again, just leads to confusion. And I'm hoping that we can get rid of that.
So is that a question or just a suggestion?
So I will say it's a question and a suggestion.
Well, let me just follow up and put it in the form of a question, Matt. Do you feel that the report adequately discounts the availability of land in Dallasport?
Yeah, I mean, I think we pretty clearly say where we do mention it, that land is not in the UGB and it was not considered, it's not part of the inventory. So from that standpoint, I'd say yes to the question. And, it's really up to you, the city, in terms of whether or not we include a mention of that in the report. We did talk about it and we felt like it was appropriate to note it. And we tried to be clear that it's not part of the inventory itself.
Okay,
So,
Andrea?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back maybe to a question that Scott was sort of asking. So Scott asked a question and then it was acknowledged that the Google sites really are set aside for Google to develop. And, I know Steve, you and I have had conversations about this. And again, I've made comments at the different workshops, but I still don't understand if the site is committed for development, why is it being included in the inventory? Because again, this is a question again that I've asked numerous times. If a company comes to me today and is looking for a 10-acre site and they look at this report and they say, so show me these 170-acre sites that you have available, that they're not really available. And so I've struggled sort of reconciling these two things. And so maybe if you could just explain again why we're including land that is set aside by a company for their future development in our inventory.
So the inventory is not really about what's available. It's about what the capacity for future employment is. Those sites are within the city, they're within the UGB. They have the capacity for future employment. They're not developed now. Therefore, they have the capacity for jobs, for people to be working on them in the future. That's what we're required to look at as part of this inventory. That's the way the inventory process is laid out in the state administrative rules and statutes. And we're pretty careful to note that those are not, that's what I was sort of talking about at the end in terms of the findings. They're not your traditionally available on the market sites, but they do have that capacity for future employment within the planning period. And Google expects to develop them within the planning period, and people will be therefore employed on those sites within the planning period. That's just how the inventory works. And I understand that, yes, you can't show, when you show people the inventory, those don't represent sites somebody can just buy and develop, but they do represent capacity for future jobs within the Dalles UGB, and we are required to include those. So I hope that explains why those sites are in the inventory. And I do understand and acknowledge that those are not sites that you can market or anybody can market for future development at this time.
Andrea, before you, CJ, do you have the answer to the original question yet?
Yes. So from an apples to apples comparison, using the net buildable acres, Google sites take up 155 out of the 175 available acres.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew, the Council Runyon has a follow-up question.
So just listening to what Scott said and Andrea said, and now with the answer of 155, it just seems like, well, the definition not being there of theoretically buildable, it should be an asterisk by there and a definition listed somewhere as to what that means for the casual reader. And the same way with 175 acres of net buildable land, if 155 is owned by Google and is on the potential building block, some kind of an asterisk there noting that would be very beneficial to folks like our port director when she's having to explain, no, we don't have that land available. So it just seems like there's some editing that could be done here that would make it clearer to the person going through this report.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think we can definitely do that. I think we're a little bit of the way there on that, but we can certainly make that crystal clear in the report.
Oh, and to clarify, if in fact Google comprises 155 of the 175, that would leave, albeit with an asterisk, it would leave 20 acres in that one box.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
So
And
86 at the top plus the 20 would leave a total of net buildable land acres of 106. Is that correct?
In addition to the Google sites, correct.
Correct. Okay.
And again, because they are considered buildable, whether or not they're
No, I get it. You're
whether or not they're
yeah.
available. But yes,
I
you're
get where
right.
you're
And I
correct.
think we could update that table to include a line items, and break that out specifically
Mm-hmm.
that way. I think that would be one way to be real clear
Yeah.
about where that is. And
And
Commissioner,
just,
hand up.
yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you for that. Scott, did you have a follow-up question you wanted to ask, or is regarding the question that Andrea started?
Well, I didn't know if Andrea was done, but I do have a question as soon as Andrea is completed with her question.
Okay, let's give Andrea a chance to complete her
I think,
list.
yeah, I think I'm done at the moment. I may have some more comments.
Okay, we reserve the right to come back to you later, as we do with everybody. Okay, Scott?
Okay, so then I'm back to page 13 of 15, the chart we we're just talking about, where roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 155 acres of the 175 are Google lands, which we've kind of all discussed or acknowledged that they're not really available for development and sale. So the thing that confuses me, and I guess how am I supposed to think about this when the chart then shows we have a surplus of industrial land in the Dalles? And I get it from where you say employment lands, but when I think about it as a person that is in economic development, you're talking about 20 some acres of industrial land for the next 20 years. And I don't understand how that translates to a surplus. I mean, in both scenarios, and the report obviously talks about there's no justification in here for an expansion of UGB, and yet we basically have 20 acres of non-Google lands for the next 20 years. That's
Exactly.
like silly. Thank you.
Matt?
So again, we are preparing this report consistent with the administrative rules, the statutes of the state of Oregon, is administered by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. These are all the terms that they use within those administrative rules and statutes. We don't make them up. That's simply how the reports are structured. And again, I think we can do more to kind of clarify the nature of that supply. And I understand that, from a certain perspective, that doesn't make sense. I get that. But at the same time, it's the way we are required to structure the reports. So And I get it. I think we can say more about what that means for y'all. And we've tried to start to do that in the findings section of the report. We can expand on that, I think, in this document. And when we say it doesn't justify, or it doesn't provide the justification for an expansion of the UGB, that's correct in terms of what you have to do to justify expanding your UGB for this purpose. So I started out saying, I know this is not what everybody wants to hear. I understand it's presents a huge challenge in terms of sites that you want to market for other companies. But it is consistent with the way the state looks at this and the way we need to look at it. So I don't know what else to tell you beyond that.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt.
Yep.
I want to,
Mayor
let's see,
Mays?
excuse me?
Mayor Mays, may I chime
Yeah,
in? please?
Greg, before you do that,
Okay.
I just like to wrap up this Walmart issue by saying that according to my arithmetic, if you were to deduct the Walmart site, and that from 100, it would result in a reduction in that one middle box from 175 down to 20 acres. And then the total in the middle would be 106 acres. And then making the necessary subtractions, instead of a surplus of 82 to 127 acres, we would have a deficit of 28 to 73 acres. Is that CJ or Matt? Did I do that the correct way?
Portion of that site is constrained, so we just want to
Yeah.
make sure we're kind of talking apples to apples in terms of the net buildable area. So I'm not sure, but CJ could tell us if not now in a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna double check, but the Walmart site is commercial/light industrial zoning, CLI, which for categorization purposes, because it does allow commercial, we group that with the commercial category. In table 5, that would be the one that had the
CJ, you're muted.
that would be the one that had the 86 net buildable acres associated with it. The Walmart fits in that top category, the commercial one.
Walmart.
Yeah, I think the question about the math would just be, I'm not sure, Mayor, if you were using kind of the net buildable acres there or the gross size of the property. That's the only reason I can't.
Yeah, I just want to get it clarified because it's such a critical part of this
and we can
discussion.
We can do that. We can, again, it's not going to change the table, but we could add a footnote to that similar to what we say about the Google sites and just indicate that, that is X percent and X and Y acres of the inventory within the commercial designations.
Right.
And it's a large site. You're right. So.
Okay. Greg Wiest, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mayor. You pretty much solved one of the 3 issues with the Walmart site. Thank you. Is there any issue about job density? For instance, I'm using the Google site, which seems to be the whipping child of the moment, rightfully so, in my opinion. Every time they build a new facility, the density of employment, I believe, is reduced because of economies of scale. Is there anything in the LUDOs or the Land Conservation Development Commission that takes that into consideration? And I have one follow-up after that, please.
So yes, and that is something we looked at in a fair bit of detail here. When we initially talked about these Google sites, those were sites we could take out of the inventory. I think it was clear from the state statutes and rules that we couldn't take those out of the inventory. But what we did talk about was looking at whether or not the relative capacity in terms of jobs, future jobs, on those sites differed from what we would assume for other properties that are zoned for industrial use. So we, again, did a number of things. We looked at how many people are employed at the facilities within the DAOs that Google owns. Initially, we just looked at, we didn't have those numbers, and we looked at what were required within the enterprise zone agreements with Google. So that was kind of where we started. We looked at how many people are employed typically and how many jobs per acre that translates into at other Google facilities. And then we got information directly from Google about how many people are employed at their facilities within the DAOs full-time, whether they're working on the site full-time, whether they're Google employees or in some cases they are contract employees, but they are employed at those sites full-time. So we looked at those numbers. And we talked to them about, is that what you would expect in the future at Google sites? And we use those numbers to then estimate the capacity for future employment at the undeveloped Google sites. We identified a somewhat lower average job density per acre for those Google sites compared to other sites in the inventory that are zoned for industrial purposes, but it wasn't a big difference. And, depending on how you look at the employment numbers, we maybe could have come up with no reduction in capacity, but we did come up with a reduction in capacity for those sites in terms of employment density, and assumed approximately, a ratio of 85% to 1 for those sites versus other sites in the inventory. So that's something we spent actually quite a bit of time looking at. And when we talked to the state about this, they said, yes, that's something you can do. You have to have the factual basis to do it. You need to have information and data to be able to justify assuming a lower employment density for those or any other sites in the inventory. So that's what we did on those sites. So might have been even more than you're looking for, but did that answer the question generally?
Did it result in a reduction in the number of acres available for development?
It did. Again, it wasn't a huge reduction, but it did result in a reduction.
All right. And last but not, no, I'm not going to say this. That's okay. Rich, it's up to you.
Yeah, again, we're concentrating right now on questions for Matt and CJ, and we will get to comments when all the questions are answered. Any more questions from anybody? Okay, I have a couple. Bear with me. Oh, here we go. On page 1, and I think Steve Harris, you alluded to this, but I wasn't sure what was meant. In the first bullet point, about 3/4 of the way down the page, this is essential in order to ensure acknowledgement by the state of Oregon and to avoid appeal by third parties. Could you give an example of who a third party might be?
Yeah, I don't want, I try not to pick on people or organizations, but I will in this case. 1,000 Friends of Oregon, Friends of the Columbia Gorge, land use advocacy organizations are the ones that typically appeal these things if they are appealed. If we were over in Central Oregon, we're kind of close, but Central Oregon Land Watch. And then those are, again, kind of the most typical appellants in these things. They keep a pretty close eye on these things. And if they think, if you adopt something and they look at it and say, hey, they don't think it's consistent with the state administrative rules or statutes, they will sometimes appeal. Again, I'm not saying they're going to or they will, but they have in the past. They've appealed a number of Metro UGB decisions, and they're going to appeal on the factual basis of the assumptions and the methodology in the report. So those are the kind of groups I was referring to. Because again, that does happen. And again, I'm not saying that they will or would, but if you want examples, those are examples of groups who have appealed in the past, similar decisions.
Thank you. Page 10, the map on page 10. Looking at the Walmart site, do you happen to know, or is it at your fingertips, what the total number of acres for the Walmart site is?
My records show the site is approximately 67 acres in size.
Okay, do you know how much of that is wetlands?
I don't have wetlands specifically. We've lumped all the constraints together, and I can say from the constraints that we use for deduction, there is approximately 29 acres that were deducted from that site in particular. So not quite half, maybe a little more than a third.
Okay, you just said the key thing though. The wetlands were deducted from the from the total.
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that kind of gets to your question earlier about what portion of that net supply of commercial land is the Walmart site. So it sounds like it's somewhere over 30 acres. So it's not an insignificant portion of the commercial supply.
Well, I guess you could look at this one of two ways. My understanding, this goes back before I was mayor, is that the wetlands was a key factor in the court ruling that has prohibited Walmart from developing the property. And if the wetlands are in fact a deterrent for that property to be developed, is it appropriate to label any of the site as being developable in light of the court ruling?
I think it is still appropriate to label a portion of the site as developable and having the capacity for commercial development. I mean, yeah, it's a constraint for sure. And we have deducted the acres that are constrained by those wetlands, but this is my personal opinion without going and asking DLCD about this in particular, but I do not think we'd have the justification to remove that entire site from the inventory for that reason. That's something we could check on.
Okay.
But I don't think we'd be able to do that.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from anybody? Questions for Matt or CJ or the staff?
Hi, this is
Andrea.
Liz.
I'm sorry.
I
No, go ahead, Ms.
in the
Turner.
chat. I just put questions in the chat. I thought it would be easier as we went along because I can't see the documents on my screen like you can. I could only see them as he showed them. So if you just read the chat, then I'll just be quiet and let you answer the questions and go on to the next person.
Okay, I'd like to recognize Andrea Klaas first, and then, yeah, we can see your chat questions and we have every intention of answering those. But first, Andrea, did you have another question?
I did. And maybe, Matt, this goes back to your explanation about that it's based on capacity for employment. So again, the way I'm interpreting what you said is that we have capacity for Google to grow, but we don't have capacity for any other business to grow. And so I just want to make sure that I'm understanding that correctly in sort of your explanation about how this land was, the available land was calculated.
I think you have limited capacity for additional jobs to be located on properties that are zoned for industrial use that are not owned by Google. I would not say none, but I would say limited for sure based on those numbers. And again, the numbers are the capacity for future employment within the UGB, no matter who owns the site, no matter who's going to develop it, no matter who's going to employ those. That's where those numbers come from. But yeah, it's a fair statement. I just would change none to limited. But yes, that's a fair statement.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions before we get to the chat? Okay, we do have one question from Greg Weist. I believe outside the UGB, and in my opinion, the housing assumes that said we had tons, but that included parks, playgrounds, cemetery, orchards, etc. I've also heard that same issue. Maybe Steve Harris, could you address that? I think he's talking about the 2017 housing study.
I think he's addressing.
Yes, the residential buildable lands inventory. That study again was based on property that is currently zoned residential and whether it is vacant or partially vacant, land that is within the city limits and outside the city limits, but within the urban growth boundary. So, and Matt, this goes back a couple of years now, so maybe even Don could weigh in on this. I don't remember specifically if there were parks, et cetera, that were in a different use than residential, but were zone residential, were included as available or vacant. But the overall findings of that study found that there was the capacity of approximately 3,600 units, again, on vacant residentially zoned land, either vacant or partially vacant. And when you continue then to parse that gross number down to land within the city limits only, land that is vacant only and residentially zoned, that number was approximately half, about 1,800 units. And again, this is over a 20-year horizon. And the other residential studies found that we have an annual demand for housing in the community of just less than, I think it's just less than 90 units per year. And we currently meet about half of that, by the way. So again, it's one of these studies that found that, again, based on the 20-year planning horizon, taking only residentially zoned vacant land within the current city limits, again, I'll put an asterisk next to the word theoretical, that there is sufficient capacity to meet the demand projected residential demand within the 20-year planning horizon, and that's consistent with, again, state law and the purposes or the reasons for the urban growth boundary. So, Matt, do you remember if the parks and other uses were included?
Yeah, so similar to this study, in any of those kind of studies, we tend to take out of the inventory certainly any land that is already an existing park. So that comes out even if it's zoned for residential use. If we know that it's planned for a future use like a school or a park, we also eliminate it from the inventory. So for instance, one of the sites we looked at in that process was one of the school sites. We identified it as partially vacant because it's a large site. I think it was like 70 acres or something like that. We assumed that 40 acres would be needed for a school based on typical school facility sizes. So the 40 acres was not included in the inventory, but the remaining 30 approximately acres was, because that would not necessarily be needed for a school facility. So we always take out parks, city-owned properties that are planned for a specific use. Again, if it's planned for like an expansion of your water treatment facility or wastewater treatment site, we would take that out. Properties in federal ownership, we tend to take those out as well. I think initially we might have had a couple of church properties in there where they had large parking lots, and we had identified them as having some capacity for residential development because they're in residential areas, but eventually, based on discussion with the city, we took those out as well. So the one thing I will note in terms of thinking about the need for future facilities, we identified the capacity for housing development, but we didn't then kind of add to that the need for land for more churches or for more parks or for more uses or facilities like that. So if the city, to really get an entirely complete picture of the land need and supply within the next 20 years, you've got to look at all that stuff. The housing needs analysis and the economic needs analysis don't always look at the need for some of those public facilities, but if a city is actually looking to do a kind of full-blown UGB expansion study or assessment study, then they've got to look at that too. So.
Thank you.
Yep.
Um, Steve, is the Murray addition to the west in the UGB? Steve, do you know the answer?
No, it's not.
Okay, thank you. The second question there has already been answered. Okay. Dallasport, I think the issue of Dallasport has been answered.
What is Google's timeframe?
Google's timeframe to have employment in its acres, I'm going to give a shot at that. That is unknown at this time because that's now that the Taylor Lake facility and the negotiations with that have been wrapped up. I would expect that their timeframe for negotiating the fourth phase would be imminent, but I can't be. We're waiting to see what happens with that. Greg, was your question answered about the employees per acre?
Yes, I was just attempting to reply to Ms. Turner.
Right. Okay. I think the next one is a comment. We'll leave that for later. Why don't you scroll down a little more? Okay. If a legal decision stopped Walmart, that set precedent. So why still include, unless court outlined a clear number of acres that is buildable? I think that, has that been answered, Matt? You want to?
I think so. I mean, again, we're following the procedures. We need to,
Right.
We're looking at a 20-year planning period. The fact that that property has been the subject of a set of legal proceedings during the last several years does not kind of rule it out of the picture in terms of looking at the 20-year supply of land in the city. And in terms of the number of acres we identified, it's consistent with how we need to look at those types of properties.
Okay. Okay, any other questions before we move to comments? Okay, we'll move to comments. Would anybody like to comment?
I would, Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Thank you. Reports are statistics. And, you know, I'm just a humble guy. I'm a musician and a retired retail guy. And when I was in graduate school, I took a statistics class. Now, why would a musician do that? I don't know, but I did. And at the end of the class, I asked the professor, I said, statistics are just numbers and you can manipulate those numbers any way you want. And he said, yeah, you can do that and almost prove anything you want. In my opinion, this report, whether Angelo did the job the best they could, and I think they probably did with the guidance that they had, I think this report does kill us as a community. We have people coming to us monthly looking for land that they can start businesses on or expand businesses on. We have to turn them away. How can that justify a 20-year buildable lands inventory? I'll stop with that, but you can understand my frustration. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Greg. Commissioner Hagee.
All right, so just a little bit of background. So I, as many of you know, some of you don't know, I spent about 15 years as the director of the Port of the Dalles here. And I started in 1991. And when I started, there was actually one building out there, was Precision Lumber was out there on some of the land that the port had actually developed with infrastructure, basically make shovel ready prior to my arriving. And then the time that I was there, we developed, we had the port basically had a couple hundred acres out in that area that they had purchased or acquired in years past. And we basically would develop sections of subdivisions, develop them, work on marketing and selling them, etc. And over the time I was there, it was obviously less in the beginning, but by the time we ended, by the time I left the port, actually, we were actually selling, and about 5 to 10 acres on average was being developed every single year. So we had a lot of land. We had a good inventory of shovel-ready sites, and we were basically using 5 to 10 acres. So in this 20-acre or this 20-year period before us, if that was still the case, we would need 100, the port would need 100 to 200 acres of land to develop over that 20-year period. So I just want to kind of make an analogy. If we are a business, and I think in some ways the city of the Dalles is a business, Wasco County is a business of sorts, we have a product. And so in economic development, the product is land, because that's essentially what you are marketing. And so to give it a little more real example, if you're a car dealer, as if David Griffith, one of our great car dealers here is, if you don't have cars to sell, you're not going to sell cars, okay? And if you don't have land to sell, you're not going to sell land. So it's kind of a crazy thing, but if we want to be in business, we have to have inventory. And I think Andrea would agree with me, and the port would agree with me, we don't have inventory. When you know, we look at the statistics in the report, and I appreciate everything that's said, and I understand that the state says you shall do it in this way, and that obviously is the way you need to do it. But in our case, it does not work. In our case, you know, what the statistics show is that we basically, under this analysis, are left with roughly 20 acres of land, of industrial land, to use for the next 20 years. And all it guarantees for us is we are not going to be having a lot of expansions or new businesses coming in here. Yes, Google has land. Yes, Google can add employment to those lands, as been stated earlier. But the reality is we have no other land for, as Andrea stated, for other businesses to grow here, local businesses, or to expand here. And I guess it's just, you know, everybody needs to understand when we talk about, a lot of people say, well, we don't need urban growth boundary expansion. You know, we have plenty of land. The reality is, and in fact, this report says it pretty clearly, we don't have an excess supply of land for anybody other than Google. And, you know, I like Google. I think they brought a lot of great things to our community, and I appreciate them being here. But if that is the only growth we are marginally to have over the next 20 years, I think that's a challenging, puts us in a challenging situation. And I think everybody needs to realize that. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Thank you, Scott.
Mike Courtney's got his hand up.
Mike Courtney.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, there's an elephant in the room that nobody's talking, except Matt kind of mentioned a little bit about the Columbia River Gorge area. Gorge 2020 planning right now is considering pretty seriously a limit forever of expansion of either 20 or 50 acres. If we don't have something right now that shows a need, we've got no argument against that. And, you know, like Greg said, it's going to kill us, because if once that gets cast in concrete, there will be no change and there will be no expansion, regardless of what we show later on. And that's what it is. You know, we may satisfy the 20-year gig for LCDC, but we are not going to get ourselves in a position where we could even 5, 10, 15, or 20 years down the road justify expansion to get through the Gorge Scenic Area problem. You know, I probably won't be around here in 20 years, but Peggy and I and a few others have been working on economic development for a long bloody time, and I hate to see it come down to this. Having said that, I would strongly urge council not to accept this report.
Thank you, Mike. I will just comment that there are some of us that are here in the room, and I mean that not literally, but, you know, virtually, that have met every week on Mondays at 3 o'clock for the last 3 months and have been intimately involved with attending Gorge Commission meetings, the elephant in the room that Mr. Courtney just alluded to, and know full well that the attitude of the Gorge Commission when it comes to the expansion of the urban growth boundary and what they're fixed to do on September 8th, this coming Tuesday, and limit our growth, as Mr. Courtney said, to 20 acres at one time and 50 acres forever. And the other three people that have joined me in these meetings and are intimately involved with the Gorge Commission and strategizing about what we can do about it have been Scott Hagee, Andrea Klaas, and Greg Wiest. So recognizing that, I'd like to ask the three of them if there's any part of Mr. Courtney's statement that they disagree with.
None on my part, sir.
Andrea is shaking her head. I see Greg or Scott is shaking his head. Okay.
Yeah, I have no, I think Mr. Courtney accurately portrays the situation.
Okay. Is there any more comments? Ms. Turner?
Mr. Mayor, I have one. If this is the appropriate time, I know that everyone there is staff, so I don't want to interrupt them. I can go last.
I think you are going last, unless somebody, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to encourage you about one thing. When I served on the county, I served on the Ag Resource Committee for about 17 years, which was the development of rewriting completely Goal 3, which is agricultural land. When we did that, we were told that there were a lot of rules and we could only do this and we could only do that. And I want to tell you, Mr. Mayor, that we did not do that. We created an ordinance based on what was needed for this county. We negotiated with LCDC and we got what we wanted by giving up one thing to get another thing. And we were able to get a 40-acre subzone for the orchards. We changed our division standard because it didn't line up with the buildable standard. In a sense, it promised things that weren't real, but they liked it that we changed it, which gave us a part of parcel option on agricultural lands for people to site a home for their son or daughter, or to sell a 2 or 3 acre parcel up to 20. It gave us flexibility. So even though I hear what your people are saying that wrote this report about it being sort of cast in stone, I would tell you that is not true, and that you can negotiate with LCDC about your unique situation with Google. You can probably get some, I just want to say there are ways to do that. Do not accept this report and end up with not being able to advocate for the city's growth in the future. It's too important. And I do believe that there are options that you can get them to agree with you on. Every city is different. So even though the rules say one thing, like the one person said, statistics can lie. And these are lying because we don't really have anything. And I think it's just really important to the county and the city. We only have one big city in our whole county to supply the needs of this entire county for a lot of shopping. It would kill the county to have no growth, not just the city. So I just encourage you to think about how you can negotiate with them about the greatest needs you have versus what are some things they would like that you could do that you can exchange. There are always ways to do that. Those people are not unreasonable if you get to really talking to them. That's sure been my experience. And so I would encourage you to look at some other options. Thank you.
Thank you. When you cited people that are not unreasonable, who exactly were you referring to? I didn't catch that.
Well, I still talk to people at the state LCDC that are in agriculture and different things. Sometimes I call them and talk to them, ask questions, ask for what kind of solutions are coming up. What can we do about this problem, that problem? They talk to me. They talk to us as a group when we did this for the county. And we took before them our special needs, and it, you know, we did this over a 2-year period, but we were able to get them to agree with us on all of the things we wanted. We got everything we wanted, and we did give up some things, but those things were really kind of inconsequential. So if you go at it really smart, there's always some things you can give up that don't really matter. Like the big one for us was we had 160 acre division standard put in place in the ag zone. Most of the parcels are over that size anyway. The 80 acre standard we went to was the buildable standard. You could not build on ag ground without it being at least 80. People were buying 80s thinking they could build on them when they couldn't, because it had to be 160 to guarantee a house. You could only
Okay.
do it on an 80 with a lot of things. That's just an example. But I'm
Okay,
just saying, keep working at it.
Thank you.
Mayor Mays? Mayor Mays?
Yes, Kathy.
Hi, thank you. I would like to make a couple comments. So first of all, in relation to the Gorge Commission decision being forever, I want to make sure that, you know, they are supposed to update their plan every 10 years. And all of us in government know that sometimes that doesn't happen on a timely basis due to resources and priorities. But forever tentatively means for 10 years. And also there could certainly be changeover in Gorge commissioners during that period of time. So I wanted to make that clarification. Another, it's not really a question, it's really more of a thought that I have around, you know, is what we're going through right now, this pandemic and this, you know, economic downturn that we are probably going to experience. I'm just wondering if that will have an effect on our economic development ideas and visions for the future. And then speaking of the pandemic, such a hard time for all of us. But one thing I always try to think about in my day-to-day dealing with this is, you know, sometimes it's just better to concentrate on what we can do versus what we can't. And I guess in economic development, I'm thinking about, are there other opportunities within the urban areas that we could purchase land, that's within the boundaries, that's available, that we could make shovel ready, redevelop it, reinvest in land, looking at properties that are perhaps underdeveloped. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there are a couple of questions in that. Does anybody want to, from the staff, tackle that?
Well, if I may, Mayor, just to kind of put this into context and economic development in general, and it depends on the community that you live in and you're working in. You know, I've been in economic development since the 1980s. I've worked in communities that have been similar to the Dalles. They haven't been constrained by a river or geologic constraints, but they've been constrained by farmlands. And in California, it was the Williamson Act, which was used to put farmland into reserve so it could be continued to be production. Absent that, it was always much easier in these communities to expand your urban growth boundaries or to expand your urban area boundaries into these agricultural lands and to develop as industrial users. One of my communities was located on the I-5 corridor in the Central Valley, so we had quite a number of large warehouse and distribution companies, which is great for that community. You know, these were buildings that were 400,000 and 500,000 square feet in size, so they were not constrained by slopes or rivers or et cetera. So again, for that type of economic development model, that was sustainable to a certain point of converting ag land into urban uses. Other communities that I've worked in economic development were part of a larger metropolitan area where there were no lands to annex or to expand because you had incorporated cities just over your city line. And the economic development strategies in those communities were not focused on developing vacant land or expanding your boundaries because you couldn't. The economic development strategies were focused on redevelopment, reuse of vacant and underutilized properties. And I think you need to change your approach or your strategies on looking inward, as suggested by Commissioner Schwartz, looking at properties that could be purchased either privately or publicly by the port or the city or the urban renewal agency, and working with private partners and to redevelop those properties into higher intensity uses, employees per acre, value of improvements. That is a sustainable approach. In my opinion, it is an unsustainable approach in the long run to focus only on the converting of vacant land for economic development purposes. In some regards, the Dalles is an island. You are surrounded by the Columbia River. You are surrounded by the urban growth boundary and the urban area boundaries of the National Scenic Area. And you have to recognize that. And so you need to do a better job of looking inwards and reinvesting in the community. Again, I don't know if the business model that the port has enjoyed success over the years is sustainable in the long run. I think there's an opportunity to revisit those long-term development strategies for both the port, the county, and the city, again, to focus on land within the current urban area boundaries. As was noted, there's an opportunity perhaps 10 years in the future, perhaps, to expand the UGBs and the UAB, but today, in today's world, and under the state guidelines, the study that has been presented to you by Angelo Planning Group is consistent with those state requirements, regardless of how you try to spin the numbers. In my graduate level statistics classes, one of my books was entitled Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. And right, but again, those are the rules that we are operating under, and those are the rules that the study needs to reflect. We can footnote the hell out of this report to make it look and address individual situations, but in the long run, this report needs to be bulletproof and needs to be bulletproof against those other stakeholders that may wish to bring lawsuits against the city. So again, the information presented in this report and the previous reports are consistent and they follow state law and state guidance. That said, we can make this as much as we can, but we do need to follow those rules. And as far as economic development strategies, they need to be sustainable. There needs to be support. There are certain uses in this community, certain potential uses. If they demand large acreages, they may just best be located elsewhere. One of the comments that Matt made in our conversations with DLCD staff regarding if there's a particular user or needs a particular type of site, that could be justification for expanding the UGB. In the city's case, you have embraced these large industrial users. The port has sold property to Google. Other private owners have sold property to Google. And that's where majority of the available industrial land has gone to, these single user, single industry sites. And, perhaps to the detriment of the community in the long run, you put all your eggs in one basket, one particular user, and you've lost that ability to diversify your local economy. As one reason why we have kept in the report the footnote about available land at the Dalles Regional Airport. Although it is not part of the buildable lands inventory, it is an economic driver for this region. If not, then I would pose that maybe the city should get out of the airport business. but the city has made a tremendous investment in that airport over the years. And we're beginning to see the fruits of those labors with the airport business park. So regardless if that business locates on this side of the river or the Washington side of the river, that business is going to bring activity to this community. With the economic opportunities analysis, we identify certain industry clusters and locational benefits of locating in the Dalles, and we need to play to those strengths. So again, this buildable lands inventory was part of that overall economic development strategy of attracting businesses and retaining businesses. That was part of the EOA. So again, the report has been produced with all due respect. We're not going to have any backroom negotiations on what we can and cannot do. It has been produced consistent with state law, and that's where we are today. So those concludes my comments, Mayor.
I have a few comments about, but anybody else like to respond?
At some point, I want to go over what I brought up earlier on. Do that now?
I'd like to follow up on Steve's remarks.
Go ahead.
Okay. Steve, let me take issue with just a couple of comments. And first, I appreciate all your service to the city over the last several years and the studies that have been initiated on with your leadership. As far as Dallasport goes, when I look at the effects of economic development, I would submit that the benefits to the city of the Dalles of any development over there would be minuscule compared to similar economic development on this side of the river. I can't think of one revenue that would go into our general fund that would come out of any development out of Dallasport. And if you look at a list of revenues, to the city, I cannot think of one. There might be some employment benefits but I don't know that would be significant enough to compare it to this side of the river. The second comment I have is really toward the whole group, and that is, I don't have any doubts that this report crosses every T and dots every I for the benefit of submitting anything to the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I have personally found working with them to be very good. I also would like to point out to the rest of the group that they submitted a 6-page letter to the Gorge Commission outlining their issues and their problems and their disagreements with the Gorge Commission's conclusions which are going to be voted on this Tuesday. And they were virtually ignored. And what I would submit to you is that even though this report, when I say you, I'm talking to the whole, everybody here. When this report is being submitted, the audience is not just going to be the Department of Land Conservation and Development, it's going to be the Gorge Commission. And I think we have to recognize that the Gorge Commission is going to look at this report and use this report. Certain members of the Gorge Commission are use this report for their benefit and for their ultimate goal, and that is to shut down any expansion in the urban growth boundary in the near future. I'm not talking about the whole Gorge Commission. I'm talking about certain members, and that observation is mine only. And if the rest of you would like to comment on that, please do so. But this is a comment from somebody who has spent many hours in Gorge Commission meetings and seeing some of the information that they put out that is not true. And I just see where this thing is headed. I guess the bottom line is I think this report, we have to recognize that the audience is much bigger than just the DLCD. I believe Kathy Schwartz, did you have a comment or a question? I thought I saw your box thing. Sorry.
No, sorry. I think I hit it by mistake. Go ahead, Rich.
No, that's all right. Anyway, that's just basically what I have to say.
I have a question.
Yeah. Linda Miller has a question.
So once the Gorge Commission makes its decisions, it's strictly the Gorge Commission that makes those decisions, or can you go back to Congress and get, I know, Rod, but I'm asking.
Yeah.
I could.
That's where it originated from, was in Congress.
Well, not only have I spent hours at Gorge Commission meetings and in committee meetings with our group, I've also had the fortune or misfortune, if you will, of traveling to Washington, D.C. And I know Scott Hagee is probably dying to weigh in here, Andrea Klaas and Greg Wiest, who have accompanied me on these trips. Darcy Long Curtis has also attended, and I would just submit that I don't see anything on the horizon that would lead me to believe that any legislation is possible at the national level that would.
It was just a question.
Yeah, would Scott, anybody else like to weigh in on that?
I don't necessarily want to weigh in on that, but I do have a comment when you're ready.
Okay, I was looking for people to agree with me.
I agree with you. No, I think, I mean, I would say.
Tim McLaughlin has also attended these Washington. Yeah.
I agree.
And Rod Runyon, yeah. Sorry, I missed you. So, okay, go ahead, Scott.
Well, just a quick comment, like generally based on the discussion we've had now, I go back to my analogy. You know, if we're in business and let's say we're a car dealer, and if all we want to do is sell used cars, you're going to pretty much limit a big part of your business. So I don't disagree, you know, with Steve's comments and Kathy as well, that, you know, we also need to work on redevelopment and reuse and all that kind of stuff. But if that's all we have, and that's all we're relying on in terms of for the growth of our community, I can assure you that our growth will be severely limited taking that strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else before I turn it over to Rod as a follow-up? Go ahead, Councilor Runyon.
So I just want to go back to something I said near the beginning. I realize from the writers of the report that it's reflective of employment opportunities and analysis of jobs on acreage and so forth. The report has rules from the state, and we all get that. But the report is owned by the collective us. Whether it's paid for with a grant or not, we paid for it, and therefore should benefit us, reflective on some of the statements we just heard. At the very least, as mentioned before, when it comes to tables that list acreage and so forth, and that's what people see, at the very least, to our benefit, it is seemingly a small item to include asterisks when acreages are listed that are substantially owned by one entity. I think it's extremely important and should be noted somehow, bold print in paragraphs, et cetera. So the things that are required by the state are in the report, but they are noticeably noted in some way or defined so that the reader will see that, you know, technically those lands are gone. We don't have large tracts of land. And I know it's noted, you know, in places within the report, but it doesn't stand out. And so it doesn't benefit our community, our area, as to what's available or not available. So I'd just like to see some of that, if there's a way to edit this report a little bit so it benefits us a little more directly or a lot more directly.
Matt, would you comment on Councilor Runyon's suggestion that we put an asterisk on the 175 number and hence the 261 number and the 82-127 number with a footnote?
Yeah, I mean, I had indicated earlier that I think it would be perfectly fine to update that table to kind of break out those numbers to indicate the acres there that are owned by or that are owned by Google and that aren't. So I think we could certainly do that. I think, as I said earlier, I think we can emphasize more strongly those points in the findings at the end of the report. We could say a little bit more about them up front so that they are more apparent. So yeah, we can certainly make edits to the report. I mean, that's not a problem for us to do that. We just need to be, our methodology and our findings have to be consistent with the rules, but we can edit the report. And if people have other specific things they want us to know, we can do that, or emphasize, we can do that. So.
Okay, I've got a question regarding that is probably going to be a stretch, but I'm going to give it a shot. Instead of having the numbers in here with an asterisk with a footnote explaining the Walmart deduction, is to have the table including the Walmart deduction and then footnoting and say the numbers could be higher if you included the Walmart property. Is that a stretch?
I think that is a stretch. I'm sorry, but yeah, I think that would be a stretch.
Okay.
I think we can definitely include the footnote. We can, we can highlight the fact that that's X number of acres, but Y number of acres is the Walmart site. So we can certainly do that.
How about an aerial photo with the Walmart property with a big red X there? Is that a stretch as well?
We might want to make it like a dashed X or something.
Okay, all right. Okay, anybody else? Councilor Long Curtis.
Thank you, Mayor Mays. So just basically a comment, a couple comments. So now that I've been through this process and I'm understanding it a little bit better, I have to say that it would have been useful if I had more fully understood up front that when we did the economic opportunities analysis, how it was going to play into this piece, because it's been a while, obviously, but when I got that report back, when I accepted it, I wasn't thinking in terms of, is this really the vision that we have for the city for the next 20 years? I took it as this is the report that the experts did on the trends for what's going to happen in your area. And now I see that if we maybe had considered that no, we wanted to work harder to attract industrial areas, that might have made a difference in this portion of the report. So I think it's just good for us all to remember as we go along and things transition, that some of that knowledge is lost or not shared by people making decisions. And I think the Gorge Commission is a good example of this. I personally think that if they're going to put this language in there, that it shouldn't be open-ended. That's why people are saying forever. I think we should at least argue that it's that their restriction is only valid until the next review of the plan. And because otherwise, when it's reviewed again, the new people are not going to remember all the drama and all the arguments from this time around. That said, I thought that the report by the Angelo Group was very good. I had some hard questions at the front because of what I was thinking about which employment opportunities we were looking to have land for. But I went over it pretty thoroughly, and I think everything was answered. I think even the Dallasport information was in there twice. And it's just a very thick report. And if you don't have any background on it, it doesn't necessarily, it's not so easy to pick all that stuff up. But the audience, I know you're saying the audience is also the Gorge Commission, but I mean, I would like to hear from our attorney, but I don't, I think that it's been done the way it has to be done. I don't think that sending it back or having somebody else going to do it is going to change the outcome, because the Angelo Group has standards, professional standards, and they've done a great job of incorporating everything we asked them to do at our last meeting. Everything that they could, and the things that they couldn't, they clearly specified why, and they put that into the report for us. So I felt like they worked hard for us within the constraints that we seem to have. Thank you.
And I would just like to say, I don't disagree with anything you've said, and I regarding the report itself and the Angelo Group, and I hope nothing I've said would lead anybody to believe anything different. Anybody else have a comment or question? Matt, did you want to say something? Oh, sorry. Okay.
Thank you.
We've had one suggestion that the council. Ms. Turner? Oh.
I just have one more comment. I asked Scott a question because obviously the major issue is the inclusion of the Google property and showing it as a benefit to the Dalles in the way that the report is required to be written. And I'm not faulting the Angelo Group. I'm just saying that in our situation, the report does not adequately reflect what the city and county might really need. So the question I asked Scott was, Google is a international organization, and I'm assuming that there are benefits to have Google in our region. And is there a way to justify and show that we have supplied the region with an important resource, but it does not give us growth for our city? Scott he would have way more knowledge on this than I would, but I think it's a really good question, because if you can show that Google is a benefit to the region, but it is not a benefit to buildable lands for jobs in our city, maybe there would be a way to adjust some of those acre numbers as a result of us providing the region with a really valuable resource. So I'll let Scott, maybe he can answer that.
Talking about Scott Hagee?
I suspect so.
Uh,
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, that's an interesting point, Liz. It really is actually from a land use standpoint, because what you're saying is that this regional benefit or this development has a regional benefit, and so shouldn't we be given kind of some grace because we've taken all this land up that provides this regional benefit? So interesting point. I'm not sure that I can answer that. I'm sure Matt would have some thoughts on that, but I think that's where it gets challenging. It probably doesn't fit in the rules or something somehow.
Matt, any comment?
I mean, I will say that when we had conversations with Google about the number of people that are employed in on their existing sites here, I was frankly surprised at how many people they employ. Not just people who are full-time employees at Google, but people who work for other firms, but who are employed on that site full-time, as well as people who then provide further support, who aren't there maybe full-time, but who are there a lot of the time. Those are some big employment numbers, and those do contribute to your local economy. Yes, they provide a regional and a national and an international benefit, but just in terms of jobs and then the money that the people who work there spend within this community, I have to believe that that's beneficial to you. So that's just me noting that I was surprised as many people work there as do. And I think you might be able to make the case that, yeah, they're also providing a regional or national or state benefit. But in terms of their undeveloped sites having capacity for jobs to employ local people, I think it's going to be hard to sort of make the case that that's not the case. That's just my opinion, but since you asked for it, that's what I think about that. I understand the comment, but I don't know that you're going to be able to make the case that you shouldn't assume that those sites represent capacity for future employment in the Dalles and that they don't benefit the local economy.
Thank you. I'm going to try and summarize where I think we are, but before I do, is there any other comments or questions anybody has? Okay. Okay, it seems to me that I've heard since my aerial photo with red X through the Walmart or the Google property has been ruled out. It seems to me that there's been two other ideas that have been thrown out here, and I'd like to get some kind of consensus. One suggestion was that the city council refused to accept the report, and the other suggestion is that we footnote table 5 on page 13 to indicate that the Walmart, the Google property has would be footnoted. So I'd like to try to get a consensus, especially from the city council who's going to be voting on this. Which of those two, or if there's a third alternative that I'm not thinking of.
Is there any possibility of getting legal counsel as far as one of those two options?
I'm not sure it's a legal question, but Mr. Kara, do you have any comments on?
I'll have to research these and get back to you.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor?
Not, oh, excuse me.
Who's it?
I think Darcy.
Julie Kruger?
I'm concerned a little bit because it sounds like you're going down the road to approving or just not approving today. And this was just a work session to take some comment from our partners. So I just wanted to make sure we're not trying to approve it today because it has to come back to the city council. It's your document for formal presentation and approval at a future meeting.
Right. I wasn't trying to imply otherwise. I'm just trying to get a consensus so that.
Made me nervous.
Yeah, and that was the
The last thing we want.
because it was unclear what the outcome was going to be if this is only simply getting a feeling of what our direction.
Right. I'm trying to get a consensus so that the staff has some direction for the final vote on the city council's part. That's all. And that consensus could be with the input of our partners, certainly, but.
Absolutely. What I heard was the footnoting and the word that Andrea brought up about theoretical being taken out or defined as changes to the report. Other than that, unless Matt, you have some other comments, I think that the report is fully in compliance.
I think we probably should get rid of the quotes around buildable. We probably shouldn't use the word theoretical unless we're real clear about what we mean by that. I think we could, or I think it's a good idea to kind of footnote that table 5. And I think we can add some additional language in the findings in the intro section about the relative, about what the city has in the way of supply that's available, to be marketed, sold, developed in the short term. I think those are all things we can add to the report. Those were the things I heard.
There was one other thing I heard that a couple or 3 people mentioned that some annoyance with the airport being listed in there twice, alluding to the fact that that's part of, even though it specifically says it's not part of our urban growth boundary or our industrial lands that we have available, it seemed to be an irritant that it was mentioned frequently in the report. So if there was any way that that could be less impactful, I think that would make people happy.
Yeah.
Actually, the report alludes to those on 2 occasions and actually makes it clear that Dallasport is not included in the inventory. Am I correct?
That's how we read it too, but that wasn't what I was hearing from some concerned people today.
Councilor Long Curtis, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. I was just going to say I would respectfully disagree with removing it because I think that is a question, maybe an elephant in the room if we don't have it clearly stated in the report that somebody's going to try to come back on. And I like having it very clearly stated with the reason in the official report.
The last sentence of the entire report on page 15 states, this land cannot be included in the BLI because it is not within the Dalles UGB. And I think the previous statement alluded to the fact that it's in another state. So is everybody in agreement? Is everybody okay?
Staff agrees with that.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's fair to leave that in as is.
I just don't see option 1 as, at this point with the clarifications, I'm in favor more of moving to option 2 with the updates and clarifications in the document to move forward. And we will have a time to come back and do a final analysis. And then with legal analysis of the process, then make a vote at that time, correct?
Yeah, just to be clear, you're suggesting that the report include all of the suggestions in the clarifications that were outlined by the city manager and by our consultant.
I agree with that, yes.
The minutes will reflect that.
Those were summarized by the addition of Councilman Runyon, and they were incorporated, so I would agree with that.
Yeah. Counselor Miller is nodding her head in agreement. Anybody else? Counselor Long Curtis is giving me the thumbs up. Counselor Runyon would still like us to do the red X through the Walmart or the property. Oh,
Absolutely.
Scott, any problems? Okay, Scott's okay with it. So it looks like we have
That's rethinking his appointment.
Scott's rethinking his appointment to the city council. Yeah. Okay, I think it's fair to say we have consensus on the part of the city council where we go from here. Any other issues that anybody would like to raise? This is last call. Okay, with that, I thank everyone for attending, especially our partners. And Ms. Turner, thank you for attending. All you guys from the Port Commission and from the county are very valuable partners. Thank you again. And again, Steve Harris, thank you very much for your service to the city. We wish you well in your future. And we'll try not to annex white salmon and get you directly affected in this whole controversy during your retirement. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
This has been quite a week.